Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming and welcome to Memorial Hall. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to thank the Monson Historical Society for putting on this great event. Now I will introduce Nick, who also happens to be Lord Monson.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Monson was inaugurated as a town in 1760, yes? And the story goes that the governor of Massachusetts then was a friend of Lord Monson, who was the president of the Board of Trade for the British Empire. However, I've just checked the dates. His pal had been dead 12 years. Oh dear. That doesn't mean to say that it still wasn't named after him, it's just maybe the news hadn't arrived. There's no email then. The second Lord Monson was possibly even more distinguished politically. He was a member of the Prime Minister's cabinet, and he was asked to leave. And they said, I tell you what, we're going to raise you in the aristocracy from being a lord to an earl. He said, no thanks. Anyway, he left anyway. So I'm going to tell you about the Monson family, after which your great town is named. And I'm going to tell you about how we started, and I'm going to take it through right through to the medieval times, and afterwards to the present day. And on that journey, we had all kinds of an extraordinary new thing happen. We had given a name to an American town, but America started giving a lot to us. But I'm going to start from the beginning. Where did Monsons, where did they come from? Now, if you are very snobbish in England and you want to basically say that you're really very grand indeed, you say we can trace our family back to the Normans. And the Normans came in a sort of a quite an unpleasant and traumatizing invasion in 1066, and they pretty much wiped out all the Saxon leaders. But before the Normans came the Vikings. Do you all know who the Vikings were? Some of you know who the Vikings were. They were the people with very long hair, and they had these helmets with horns on them, and they had a great interest in English womenfolk and all the gold from the monasteries, and they were a pestilential nuisance. Eventually, one of the kings of England, King Alfred, said, look, can we do a deal? And he said, we will give you part of England. We'll just give it to you. And so the Vikings said which part, and they pondered it and said, okay, and the deal was peace, to stay within your borders within England. And the bit of England that Alfred gave them was Lincolnshire and part of Yorkshire, and Lincolnshire is where the family come from. All the names in Lincolnshire and a certain part of Yorkshire are all Danish, Scandinavian, Norwegian, Swedish, call it what you will. And our name, Monson, is completely Danish. And where all the towns and the villages, like for instance, I'll come on to it later, but the first title, the inherited title that we received was a baronetcy. And the Monson of the day was Sir Thomas Monson of Carlton, town of Carl. It's completely and utterly Scandinavian. So, and then his great-great-grandson was made Lord Monson, Lord Monson of Burton, again, another Scandinavian name. So to all those people who say, well, we came from the Normans, we said we came even earlier, we came with the Vikings. First recorded Monson, they didn't really keep great records back in the 14th and 13th century. There were plagues and people didn't do that much writing, and what writing there was sort of often got destroyed or lost. But we do have a recording of a Monson in 1375, which makes us a pretty old family. And the next time that the time that we start to sort of become noted is when the young Henry V decided to go and claim a whole lot of land in France. And he went over on a kind of in a raiding party, and they went around causing havoc. And they were trying to retreat back to England. The supplies were running short, and the men had grown tired, and they were suffering from dysentery and goodness knows what. And the French army basically cut them off. And the French army was absolutely, well, much superior in numbers, and they were fresher. And they said, we're going to have a battle with you, and England couldn't get out of it. The person that Henry V relied upon for the munitions was John Monson, my direct ancestor. And it was his job to make sure that there were sufficient bows and arrows, and the men were all well equipped and sufficiently well fed. This extraordinary battle took place when the English, against all odds, won. And it was all thanks to the longbow and the extraordinary brilliance of the archers. And the other thing that they had in their favour was it was very wet and muddy. And when the French cavalry charged and the first lot of arrows slammed into the French cavalry, they fell down, and they fell down into slightly boggy ground. And so the other horses had to go and jump over them. And then more arrows came down, and it became absolute carnage. The English just completely wiped them out. And it became a very famous battle, and it's celebrated in the works of William Shakespeare. So that was back in 1415. Do we hear about any Monsons in the rest of that century? No. But back in the 16th century, Henry VIII was going about a sort of a revolution in Britain. Besides sort of his extraordinary story with his different wives, he was getting rid of all the monks from the monasteries. He felt that the church had far too much power, and he wanted their money. So that's how the Reformation came about in Britain. And he needed new men to support him. And the Monsons were chosen as basically the leading men of Lincolnshire. And Lincoln was then a very important town. It's one of the third or fourth most prominent in Britain. So the Monsons rose up in power, and there is the story goes was that Sir John Monson was invited to be knighted, and to be knighted is to be made a sir. You have to be sort of regarded as being a gentleman, and that was back in 1536. And so the story goes that he and a few others of the new men of Henry VIII were called upon to be knighted in a ceremony. And on the same day, in another part of the palace, one of the king's wives, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded. So you had an axe falling on the neck of a queen, and you had the shoulders of the new men being tapped by a sword. So the Boleyns went down, a few families like the Monsons went up, 1536. Now, it wasn't just Sir John Monson. Later on, Henry, after Anne Boleyn was beheaded, he received he asked his chancellor at the time to go, and he said, I need a new woman to marry. And he said, yes, Your Majesty, you do. And I have found the perfect one. She just ticks all the boxes. And she's called Anne of Cleves. And Henry VIII said, I want to see a picture of her. Now, obviously, this is before, the invention of the camera. So they had a court painter called Holbein, and Holbein painted a picture of her, but he made her much more lovely than she, in fact, really was. And Henry was absolutely appalled. For some reason, he went through with the ceremony, and he said, I can't continue with this. And so he agreed to pension her off, and she needed someone to look after her. She was very religious. And he asked amongst his new men, he said, do you know of anyone who can comfort her and look after her? And Sir Thomas Monson said, yes, well, I've got my brother. Sir John Monson, that's it. My brother Thomas. So Thomas Monson became the companion of the Anne of Cleves the rest of her life. We then move forward a bit, and we come to this chap called, he was Sir Thomas Monson, and he was a very fine, good-looking person. And I think this is him just here. Sir Thomas Monson. Okay. King James liked Thomas, and Thomas contributed to the royal coffers for a war that they were having in Ireland, and the deal was done that anyone who was father or grandfather had been knighted could be made what's called a baronet. And a baronet is like a hereditary sir. So he was the first baronet, 1611. And the title remains with the family. So that's the first of my titles. I am Sir Nicholas Monson, as well as being Lord Monson. He's the first baronet, I'm the 16th. Okay. Thomas, lovely chap, got into a bit of trouble. You tended to hang around those days with people who lived in the countryside nearby you. And I think one of the people he hung around with was a rich landed family called the Elwises. Anyway, the Elwises and a few other people got involved in some court intrigue. And apparently something dastardly happened. There was a very saintly man, very nice, decent chap called Sir Thomas Overbury. And for some reason, they didn't like Overbury, and Overbury came to a sticky end. You know, Elwis was hanged for it, but for a period of time, Sir Thomas was under suspicion. Now, Sir Thomas had just been made keeper of the Tower of London. And he actually, the soldiers came to see him and they said, Sir Thomas, we've come to report you. And he said, very good. He said, no, we've got to put you inside one of the cells. And so he was basically on remand, I suppose. At the same time, his brother, who was an extraordinary man, an admiral on the high seas, great friend of Francis Drake, and Sir Walter Raleigh, took part in some extraordinary great naval expeditions. And the word came through from the ambassador, British ambassador in Spain, that some Spanish commander had successfully bribed Sir William. So he too was put in the Tower of London. The papers went to one of the advisors of James I, a very famous man called Sir Nicholas Bacon, very intelligent man. And Sir Nicholas Bacon looked at the papers and he said, no, no, no. These men are, he said, Sir Thomas is innocent, so he was let out. And as for Sir William, he said, well, maybe he did take a bribe, maybe he didn't, but everyone else has round here, so, you know, he's going to be cleared. So he was back on naval duty. Sir William wrote a book called Naval Tracts. Naval Tracts is regarded as the first book to be written in modern English. It's an extraordinary book, and it was published 80 years after his death, and remained a kind of there wasn't much of a publishing industry, but it was certainly equivalent of a bestseller for 200 years. And the most interesting thing about it is his dedication to his eldest son. And he gives advice in beautiful Elizabethan, James I prose on all aspects of life, from marriage, advice against swearing, the kind of clothes that you should wear, not to get involved with women who aren't your wife, and he had extraordinary foresight. He hated tobacco, and he said people who continually smoke, it dries the brain and they become fools with the use of it, and he said that the breath of him that takes it is offensive to others. I mean, that was spot on. That was back in about 1620. Back to Thomas Monson. Thomas Monson has a few children. In those days, you could have about 9 children. You'd be lucky if 2 survived to 20. So he had 2 children surviving. One became a great lawyer, and the other was quite ambitious. And he spent his part of the family fortune raising himself into the nobility, which you could do with a bribe or 2 in those days. And he ended up as Viscount Monson of Castlemaine. He was he led a very interesting life. He was, the Civil War happened, and his brother, the lawyer, advised Charles I on the legal aspects of being royal. And he had to go out, part of his duties was to read the King's speech at Lincoln at the outset of the Civil War, our Civil War. And the war started, it went well enough for the Royalists. In the meantime, his brother, the Viscount, was sort of sat on the sides, and eventually he came in, not with the king, but with Cromwell. And when Cromwell basically won, and Charles I had been executed, and Charles II was on the run in Europe, Cromwell rewarded the Viscount and said, you can have all the lands and the money of your brother. And the brother was put into exile in Somerset. I know it's not abroad, but if you've been to England, going to Somerset feels like being abroad, I can tell you. So there he was, high on the hog, doing very well. And then the Restoration. Cromwell died, and then there was the Restoration. Back came Charles I's son, Charles II. And obviously he didn't particularly like all those aristocrats who'd sided with Cromwell. And he didn't like Viscount Monson of Castlemaine, because Viscount Monson of Castlemaine had actually attended 2 of the sittings, the court, the trial of Charles I for treason. And just because he attended, he wasn't executed, but he had everything stripped off of him, and he was put into prison for the rest of his life. And he was, once a year, he was taken out in chains from Fleet Prison, and he was marched to the Tower of London and back, being pelted with rotten eggs and tomatoes and being jeered at. And that's how he finished his life, risen to being a great viscount, very rich, and then suddenly the wheel of fortune turns, and it's in the equivalent of something like Guantanamo Bay. It was pretty rough for him. So John had all his lands restored, and it's from his line that I come. And the Monsons were, that's the Viscount's line died out, Sir John's flourished, and the royal family looked upon us most favourably. Then we were owed, apparently the feeling was that we were owed and we should just properly come into the aristocracy. This happened in 1728, and John was his name, and John was quite rich. He had a lot of land, about 15,000 acres in Lincolnshire, and large estates elsewhere. And he died in 1648, and his son, the second Baron, as I said, became a minister, and he refused to take this higher movement upwards in the aristocracy to becoming an earl. So that's the second Baron. And then you have this business, Monson town here, being inaugurated, being called Monson. And I think that I think it's likely, on the balance of things, that the governor of Massachusetts did have a relationship with the Monson family, and whether it was the first or the second Lord Monson who was that was the inspiration for this town to be named after us, I don't know. Further investigation to follow. Okay, now then there was a marvelous moments in Monson history. We had there was a time when moving on about 100 years, there was a tussle, as ever, between England and France on the empire, and there was anyway, the English managed to win in India against the French, and the person who committed the, I use the French word, the coup de grace against them was Sir George Monson. And Sir George was a very effective and brave soldier, and he became one of the governors of the East India Company. And he was regarded as being an absolute brilliant general. Now, unfortunately, he had a nephew, Colonel William Monson, and he came under the Duke of Wellington's command. This was before the Napoleonic Wars. And he was sent northwards with another general, to whom he was actually number 2, so the other general really got the brunt of the blame. But they were sent northwards to quell some difficult Indians in the Punjab. Now, all of us here know the history of what happens when you go into that area. You know, we're talking about Pakistan, we're talking about Afghanistan. People come dreadfully unstuck. Even the great invader, Alexander the Great, he got unstuck there. And so it was with William Monson, and he went out with a very big force, and he came back with about 8 people. And the Duke of Wellington heard how the story went, and he said he was tricked and deceived at every turn. And he had a fondness for the colonel, and he said, I said, he's just an unlucky general. And that's where the term first started. I don't know whether you know, Napoleon, when he was ravaging all of Europe, he said, you know, people say, is this soldier, you know, is he good? Is he a good officer? Is he a good leader? He said, all I want to know is he a lucky leader? So that Monson, unfortunately, was unlucky, where his uncle was, well, very, very talented. We move on a bit up to towards 1890s, thereabouts. And this is where America comes into our family. Because there is this, my great-grandfather, when he was out on his travels, met this most astonishingly beautiful woman who was a widow. She's called Romaine. And there's Romaine down there. Isn't she pretty? Anyway, that's Romaine. One of the most extraordinary things was me knowing that she had this father who'd been served for the North in the American Civil War, and called Roy Stone. And Roy Stone came from Pennsylvania. He was working for his father in western Pennsylvania, where they had an estate of about 7,000 acres. And they had a lot of tough lumberjacks working with them. And when Abraham Lincoln made his a call to arms, he asked for 75,000 volunteers. Roy Stone went and called up his lumberjacks and said, "What about it, boys?" And they said, "Fine." He said, "Well, I know a bit about soldiering. I think he might have gone to West Point." Anyway, he drilled them, trained them, and then they cut down some more trees, created some boats, and they went down the river as a drilled regiment to go and report for action and duty. However, when they arrived, they said, "Oh, no, we don't need you. You can go back. We've got quite enough men." And the president says anyway that this little disagreement over Fort Sumter, it's only the last two or 3 months. So Roy Stone suspected his own. He said, "Actually, I'm not sure whether he should be quite so optimistic." Anyway, Roy was right, and his well-drilled regiment became on the front line, and it became quite feared, I understand, by the Confederates. They were very well drilled men, sharpshooters. They were tough. And what was interesting, I learnt doing some further research, was that when Roy arrived with his troops, they came not as a proper regiment. They came just as a group of men, of volunteers. And it's they who decided. They had a vote who's going to lead them, and they chose Roy. So these people elected their leader, these soldiers, and anyway, Roy and his men go through a number of different engagements, and some of them, are very tough against the Confederate soldiers. I mean, everyone was extremely brave in those days. And come just before the Battle of Gettysburg, Roy was told to go and needed fresh men. So by this time, he was in charge of 3 regiments. The 149th, the 140th, these are Pennsylvanian volunteers, 146th and 143rd. And they were all, many of them had never fired a rifle before against an enemy. He found himself, he was under the orders of General Doubleday. And General Doubleday gave a command to Colonel Roy Stone, as he then was. And he said, "You've got to hold a particular place, and you're going to come under a lot of the fighting is going to be very difficult. You're going to be up against superior numbers. And you're probably going to lose, but you must hold out for as long as possible." And Roy Stone went and was very honest with his troops, and he said, we're going to have to be prepared to die for our country. And they all whooped and threw their caps in the air and said, if that's what you want, Colonel, we'll do it. They absolutely adored him. And anyway, the battle started, and he, through a mixture of bravery on the part of his men and trickery, he used trickery to hold the position as long as he could. The thing was that the Confederates were very keen to get the colours of the 149th Regiment, who had given them such difficulties in the past. And what he did was he moved the 149th colours away from the 149th and placed them in odd, strange places, kept moving them around. This completely confused the enemy. Anyway, there was, eventually the enemy prevailed. The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg was regarded as a victory for the Confederates. But General Doubleday said, yes, that may be true, but because Roy Stone held the key point, we could all get the rest of the forces into position for the rest of the battle. Roy Stone has since been commemorated. He has a street named after him on the Gettysburg battlefield. And I went to see it the other day, and I reread some of the accounts, and I must say I was moved to shed a few tears. He was, General Doubleday reported, he said it was, the men were extraordinary, very brave. 2/3 of them lost their lives. And he said Stone was battling to the very end, and he had a bullet in his hip and a bullet in his arm. And somebody the other day gave me one of the bullets found on the Gettysburg battlefield, and they're heavy, and they did a lot of damage. Roy was never really recovered, I don't think, from that injury, but he soldiered on. But I think it's been said that once you've had a kind of an injury like that, you become instinctively more cautious. You lose your kind of elan and bravado. But when he returned to take up his position again after medical treatment, apparently all the survivors of those regiments cheered him. And he was regarded as a great man. And my interest in him is in I don't know, people know about racing horses. When you want to have a marvelous racehorse, you find parents for that racehorse who are pretty marvelous as well. And I think there's something in his spirit which has come through to my side of the family. And as I'll tell you a bit later, I've had a few kind of, I've been hit by one or two tragedies. And people say, well, how do you do it? How do you carry on? And I said, well, I have the inspiration of Roy Stone. I said, he was made, by the way, a general on the battlefield. So he's the man of all my ancestors I probably revere the most. Oh, sorry, one thing I forgot about was the first Lord Monson. Now, we don't know whether this chap whether he really was Lord Monson. The problem was that he didn't attach names to the bottom of the pictures. In all our speculations of the different historical pictures that I own, we sometimes give them funny names. And my wife Silvana refers to possibly the first Lord Monson as Bad Hair Day. He does look rather grumpy, doesn't he? So Roy Stone's daughter marries my great-grandfather, and she is conceived It is reported on the, I'll probably say this wrong, the Potomac? How do I say it? Potomac. Yeah. Anyway, who knows little did she know what fate was that was going to come to her, because she ended up, through the Monson connection, she met Queen Victoria. And through Queen Victoria, she met all the royal relatives around Europe. And she was seconded to be the senior lady in waiting to the Tsarina of Russia in St. Petersburg. So from Pennsylvania to St. Petersburg. They had a son, my grandfather. 1901 he was born. And he too met a spirited and lovely American woman, and called Betty. And Betty died just a few years back, at 103. And Betty was raised in America. She spent a lot of time traveling with her father, who was this extraordinary adventurer. I give to you Edward Alexander Powell. Edward Alexander Powell was started off as a journalist. He also worked in the American diplomatic service. I don't quite understand how those two positions could work side by side, but somehow they did. And he became a war correspondent. And during the First World War, America, for the first 3 years, was neutral. But he wrote these books about the fighting in France, and they were published as articles in America and in England, too, by the Daily Mail. And he wrote in this very robust way, and he always made sure that he was given plenty of glory in his accounts of what happened. But I'm sure that he was actually as brave as he said. He certainly looks very tough, doesn't he? In 1917, when America joined the Great War, he came out as being a captain of American intelligence. I don't quite know how, but he must have been somewhere near the front, because he got very badly wounded. And anyway, he emerged from the war there, and he decided to travel around and send in further reports of adventures around the world. And he wrote about 20 books, and they are with titles like By Camel and Car to the Peacock Throne. That was visiting Iran, by the way, meeting the Shah of Persia, as he then was. There's another one called Yonder Adventure. Stories about headhunters in Borneo, meeting the Dalai Lama, of whom he had a kind of quite a disrespectful attitude. He called him his dirtiness. But he was a tough man, and goodness gracious me, he was my great-grandfather, and I certainly sort of was full of admiration for him. And he wrote a book just before he died, a summation of all his of everything that he'd done. He called it Adventure Road. You can get it on Amazon. Betty was a fabulous woman, my grandmother, and she tragically lost her husband, my grandfather, when he was just 51. And then my father inherited, at a very young age, 24. And he became spent a lot of time in the House of Lords, which he had the automatic right then to enter, and he eventually ended up as being president of the Society of Individual Freedom. He was always on the lookout, supportive of the small guy, the little man. And I revere his memory. Now, on my mother's side, we had some, I thought I just might mention this, we had some very interesting blood. Do many of you know the name Dylan Thomas? Well, I don't know whether you know, Dylan Thomas married a sort of a crazy Irish woman called Caitlin. She drank a lot. She fought. She was not always faithful to her husband. Caitlin is my great aunt. I've inherited none of her DNA. Her sister, my grandmother, was a marvelous woman called Nicolette DeVass, and she wrote a book again. Get it on Amazon, and it's a really good book, Two Flamboyant Fathers. Now, what of the future? What's going to happen now? You see, in the old days, there was a kind of a system whereby if I didn't produce an heir, the title moves sideways along my generation until it drops again to another male heir. Well, that's all finished now. 5.5 years ago, I had a son called Alexander, was picked up by the police under strange circumstances, and he was taken to the police station, and he didn't come out alive. He was beaten up. And so there's an investigation been running into this for 5.5 years. There's an inquest which is continues to this day. I have been campaigning so that my daughter can inherit the family title, but I'm pretty much up against a brick wall. But I'm continue fighting. Unfortunately, my brothers, my cousins, and I have no male heirs. So as the law is, probably the Monson name gets extinguished. So you're probably looking at certainly probably not the last Lord Monson, but the last generation. And anyway, the American, one more thing about, tell you about Remain. I imagine that the American people feel that the English probably got a lot out of us before they got their independence. And I'm one of the things is I like patriotism, but I don't like kind of nationalistic rivalry. And I think that I want you to know is that the family joined with Remain in 1912, when there was a terrible tragedy in April 1912, the Titanic sinking. And we didn't lose any members of the family, thank goodness, but we were absolutely appalled about what happened. And she set up this fantastic charity fund for the families of those who were lost at sea. And so actually about half the Monson fortune went to those people, and I think that's a very good thing. Oh, and the final piece of interesting history is my great-great-uncle, Sir Edmund Monson, he rose in the diplomatic service to become ambassador for England in France. And as I explained, England and France had been bashing each other for hundreds of years. It was just, deep in their blood. They just hated each other. And he designed a treaty to say, for goodness sake, it's not in our interest to fight every time there's a bit of friction over our respective empires. And he came up with this treaty and it was called the Entente Cordiale, and it was basically to get rid of all the areas of friction, because every time something happened, the French press and the English press would encourage the ministers to build battleships, raise armies, and go to war. And he thought this was a nonsense. And as such, we became leg-locked into friendship with France. And what's interesting is it's been speculated by a couple of historians that were it not for that treaty, England might well have supported Germany in the First World War, and the whole shape of the world would be completely different. So that is the story of the Monsons. One more thing. I'm going to get to the Monson coat of arms. I was rather appalled that you don't have one here. So I'm going to get one created for you for the town of Monson. Disappear. Any questions? Yes.
You mentioned that you have been an advocate for allowing the titles to go from sending down to females. I thought there was a change when the Duchess just before she had her first child, that there was a way forward.
You're absolutely right, but it was well remembered. The problem was it's only for the royal family. Not for other title people. I mean, it's not very fair, is it? No, what should be sauce for the royal goose should be sauce for the titled gander. Yes, that young lady there, the young historian, yes. Sorry, I couldn't hear that. How long has my family been in America? Well, on this trip, about 2.5 weeks. We made many visits to America, but what we did was we snatched some of the most beautiful women from America and brought them over to England. You better watch out. Sorry?
Where do you live now?
Where do I live now? I live in London a bit, and I also have got a historic guest house that Savannah, stand up so everyone can see you. Go on, I know you're shy. This is Savannah, my wife. Savannah and I have been doing up this historic house called Victoria Spa, and it was an old hotel built to support some natural springs just outside Stratford-upon-Avon, which some of you will know is where Shakespeare was born and where he died. And when we bought this house and we looked into the history of it, and we discovered that it was called Victoria Spa because Princess Victoria, as she then was when she was 19 years old, came over to stay in the hotel, and she allowed the hotel to put her personal coat of arms in the gables and in the fireplaces, which we still have. So, and then 6 weeks later, she became Queen of England and all its colonies. Not America, unfortunately. You'd left us. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, unless I missed it, was there any history or stories about the Revolutionary War? with the Monson family?
Well, the second Baron did make comment, interestingly, I read, and I haven't got to the bottom of it, about a rebellion in 1865 in Massachusetts. Do you know about that? Some of you know about it. So we didn't. I don't think the Monson family had any lands here, so we would have just been, sat back and watched England take a mighty hit. We're sorry to lose you. Anyone else? Yes.
Are you aware that some of the settlers from this town went up and started a town in Monson, Maine?
Yes, indeed. Yes, I've looked it up on the internet. Monson, Maine has got a population of about 680, and you'll find town is 8,500. And they are, and the two towns, there is a relationship that the Monson in Maine was named after Monson, Massachusetts. And Dennis here, your illustrious president of your historical society, explained how that came to be, but I can't fully remember. So I have to ask Dennis. Anyone know a good bar in town? Sorry. Sorry? The battle was Agincourt. 1415, yeah. Anyone else want to ask me anything? Yes?
Just one thing, going back to Cromwell and the restoration after Cromwell.
Yes.
He died and his body was exhumed, and it was obviously you probably x-rayed things about that, but do you have any recollection or from your family in terms of that whole sort of, when Cromwell's body was, exhumed and all of that? I don't know if it's anything worth talking about, but I was just wondering if you had mentioned that as one of the important theories in your family.
Yes. I don't know. All the talk has been about the exhumation of the body of, was it Richard III, found in a car park in Leicester, and that sort of just fascinated everybody. I do know something interesting about Cromwell. Everyone said, "Oh, Cromwell exterminated and everything." Well, his son continued to live in North London under another name, and he was never bothered. Never bothered. And all the other people involved with Cromwell were all chased and pursued around all of Europe, and were assassinated. And he continued to live in North London, so I'm told. Yes, Dennis.
Have any meetings with the royal family?
How many meetings with the royal family? Well, I've met members of the royal family. I was once involved in a charity do for the Commonwealth where Princess Margaret was our patron, and she was given, we raised a lot of money at this big charity event, big dance. And I was kind of in my early 30s, and the chairwoman of the committee came up to me and said, "Nicholas, do you realise you're the only man on the committee?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, you're the only man, it's your duty to ask Princess Margaret to dance." I don't know whether you know anything about Princess Margaret. She's not the most easy of people. Not a sweet woman. Anyway, I did as I was told, and her table was close up to the wall, so I had to ask her. I had to go slide up against all those people there, looking at me, sort of say, "What are you doing here?" So, slid along. And then I came up to her, and I was so flustered and embarrassed. And I knew that I should bow, but I got into a muddle. I did a curtsy as well. And I said, Your Highness, or your Majesty, and she just looked at me sort of in a steely way, and I sort of blustered, and I said, went red in the face, and I said, it's my duty. No, it's my honour to ask you to dance with all. Because I'm the only male member on the committee. Oh my goodness, what am I saying? And she looked at me and said, no, thank you. My shoes rather hurt me. Thank you. Goodbye. I felt then, joining the Republican Party, I can tell you. My next encounter was, again, at a charity event. And it was a time of the breakup of Prince of Wales and Princess Diana. And they were supporting a charity to do with the mentally afflicted. And for some reason, in a rather crafty way, all the senior members of the media from different newspapers had bought the tickets. And none of these people really knew how to behave. And I was, to this day, I'm sort of really annoyed and upset because there is a protocol that when the Prince of Wales and his princess get up to dance, after the first dance, everyone joins them. And none of these people knew how to behave. I mean, they may have been dressed, properly, but they just didn't know how to behave. So they just sat in their seats and dance after dance. Prince Charles and Princess Diana, as if they're giving a show to us. So I said to my wife, come, this is ridiculous, we're getting up. And for the next 20 minutes, it was the royal couple, myself and my wife. And I sort of, one of the few things I'm good at is this kind of rock and roll Scirocco dancing. So you spin something around, push some down, and pull them back. And I thought some devil got into me, and I started doing this with my wife, throwing her at Prince Charles, and then pulling her back at the last moment. Anyway, so that was my bit of fun. And then there was a slow number came on, had to dance like this. So then I was looking into my wife's eyes, dancing like this. And suddenly there's this mouth comes up to my ear. And the mouth says, it's cozy here, isn't it? I don't know, my goodness, it's the Princess of Wales. She said, it's cozy here, isn't it? And under those sort of circumstances, you'd think, oh, I'm going to come up with such a witty response and retort. But I didn't. I said, yes. And my wife at the time interpreted what Princess Diana was doing. This is completely innocent, thank God, there's just the four of us on this huge dance floor, as being something else. And she looked at Diana, eyes went like this, and she went, sss. And I thought to myself, no, you've got it all wrong. And then Diana just looked her up and down, as if to say, who are you? I went, ha! And then swung Prince Charles away. And Prince Charles, by the way, during all of this, he was dancing. Just wishing he wasn't there. So those are my encounters with the royal family. Any other question? Well, oh yes, lady at the end, yes.
Technically, would you be able to take a place in the House of Lords and then House of Lords at any point in your life?
Yes, I could. The position on the hereditary lords has changed since my father's time. In 1999, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, pushed through legislation saying that only 1 in 10 hereditary peers could stand in the House of Lords, and the rest weren't allowed in there. And I have to find some time to curry favour with one of the parties to get elected. But you only get elected when when one of the other lords died. So you're sort of waiting in dead men's shoes. And people are living a long time, and also the lords don't go and gracefully retire. They don't. They really don't. I was up for election a few times, and I went in to make a speech, and I thought, oh, I'm going to sort of, just wow them with my rhetoric. And I think of about 24, about 8 were asleep as I spoke. The average age is about 86. It's quite extraordinary. But who knows? Yes? Sorry, I can't. You're making notes. Well, thank you very much. I'm very honoured. Okay, well, I'm going to count 5, 4. You've got to ask anyone to raise their arm in the next 5 seconds, otherwise I'm finished. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much.